Jazakallahu khair. So we begin in the name of Allah. All praise and glory be to Allah, and may His finest peace and blessings be upon His Messenger Muhammad and his family and his companions and all those who tread his path. We ask Allah to grant us and you a life upon His path and a death while adhering to His guidance and a reunion around Him. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for coming through and dedicating these nights, inshallah, to what will be, what we ask Allah to allow it to be, what the Prophet ﷺ would ask Allah. Oh Allah, allow the Quran to be the spring that waters, that irrigates, that quenches our hearts, and allow it to be Nura Sadri, the light of our chests that illuminates and enlightens our chests. Wajala'a Huzni, and allow it to be the means of removal for our sadnesses, our griefs. وَذَهَابَ هَمِّي, and that which chases away and causes to depart our worries and anxieties. We ask Allah to allow the Quran to be all of that for all of us. Allahumma ameen. And we ask Allah to allow us to meet the month of the Quran while in the best of states. I ask Allah to make this gathering in our scales of good deeds, every last one of us, and to make all of our actions righteous and make them sincerely for His sake, and not allow any of His creation a share of our intentions. May Allah purify our hearts and our minds, protect us from insincerity, protect us from delusion and conceit and self-deceit and misguidance in all of its forms. Allahumma ameen. Okay. The Quran, y'all can see my screen, right? The Quran as the miracle of miracles. We want to try to crunch this subject into these next 2 nights together. Why are we studying this? The proof that the Quran is a miracle. Many of you may recognize the logo in the bottom right. This is sort of a part of the final prophet research that Yaqeen had me lead, not drive on my own, but lead in the past 2 years, because this is not just about proving Islam is true to others and articulating Islam in the most apt way. Being conversant in our da'wah narrative and refining our craft in da'wah is an obligation. It's part of the insight we use in giving da'wah, that Allah commanded us to be wise and be insightful in our da'wah, to have basira, to have hikmah. But just for us, the Muslim needs to know that the yaqeen, conviction, has no ceiling. So we want to add conviction on top of our conviction in the Quran. We want also to recognize that yaqeen is not static. The same way it grows, it also diminishes. And faith wears out in one of you the same way a garment wears out over time, the Prophet ﷺ said. So you need to ask Allah to renew your faith. And so the Quran, being the fountain of our faith, is true. And it is even more true when you refresh what the Quran actually is, that you have more and more reasons, or you remember more and more justifications for this actually being Allah speaking from above 7 skies, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, we call it here the miracle of miracles because it is the greatest sign. It is the greatest sign of the truth of this deen, the greatest sign of Islam, the greatest reason for people to become Muslim is the Quran, even in translation, subhanAllah. And, even when the Pew Research Center was trying to study why Islam is the fastest growing religion, in the world, even in places where it has a bad reputation in the media, even in places where it doesn't have that much resourcing, the number 1 and number 2 reasons why people were becoming Muslim, according to Pew, was that the beliefs just make sense. And obviously they mean the beliefs they find in the Quran. And number 2 was that I read the text myself. And this was prophesied by the Prophet ﷺ, that this would be seen as the greatest of all proofs, the greatest of all miracles, the greatest of all signs for the divine origin of Islam. In an authentic hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ said, there has never been a prophet except that he was given that which would cause the people to believe in him. Like to endorse, verify the integrity of what he's claiming. I'm a prophet from God. He says, وَكَانَ الَّذِي أُوتِيتُهُ وَحْيًا فَأَرْجُو أَنْ أَكُونَ أَوْحَاهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيَّ فَأَرْجُو أَنْ أَكُونَ أَكْثَرُهُمْ تَبَعًا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. And what I've been given is this special revelation. Doesn't mean it's the only thing given, but what I've been especially given, the most special thing I've been given. Of course, there are so many other proofs that he was given, right? But what I've been especially given, he said, is this revelation that Allah inspired to me. And as a result of it, as a result of the Quran, above all else, I am hopeful to have the most followers out of them. Out of who? Out of the prophets that were all given signs. I was given this one, and I'm hopeful because of it to have the most followers out of them on the day of judgment. By the way, feel free to raise your hands and ask questions or type them in the chat at will. That'll let me know that you guys are still alive. Yeah, Zoom fatigue is real, and it's the end of a long day. And I also want this to be as interactive as possible so that you can keep refreshing your attention. So throw it in the chat, or even throw your hands up, raise your hand electronically, or if you're comfortable turning on your camera as well, all that works. Okay, so here's the thing, and I want to try to like oscillate or try to, rotate between the proofs for Islam being true and what could be like a misconception or like a potential pushback that shaitan could whisper into someone's head, someone you're talking to, or about, common misunderstandings, misconceptions, hindrances to appreciating it. So it's totally understandable how the Quran is the miracle of miracles, because if you look at all the other miracles, they were temporal. They were like at some moment in history, even if it were verified, still it's not firsthand. So it's a little different. All the prophets, including our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, their other miracles were temporary. We hear about them from reliable sources, so we believe in them, but it's not like it's something I get to engage with firsthand. And there is some truth to seeing is believing. There is some truth to seeing is believing. Of course, belief in the unseen is absolutely necessary, but the fact that you believe stronger because you saw yourself, that is, there's nothing problematic about that. Ibrahim alayhi salam wanted more yaqeen by seeing how Allah gave life to the birds. Musa alayhi salam was told your people went astray, but he was told, Allah told him directly. But when he went and saw them worshiping a cow, he threw down the tablets, right? So seeing does add to someone hearing something. It's not like someone seeing it for themselves. So in that sense, it's understandable that the Quran is the miracle of miracles. But what's not easily understandable sometimes, or what's not expected, is that the miracle of miracles is gonna be a book. You get it? Like, how can a book, a work of literature, words, ever qualify to be a miracle? Right? That's what catches people sometimes. Like, it's not like the skies opened and we saw something come down, or a rock opened and a camel walked out, like the people of Thamud. It's, the moon didn't split. So how can a book be a miracle? That's what we want to work through, inshallah. We want to speak about some of the many dimensions that convince us compellingly that the Quran actually is a miracle. So let me ask you guys, what makes the Quran a miracle? Raise your hands and then grab the mic, or just throw it in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to have a shouting match. Marillas, go for it.
They are the actual words of God.
How do we know that? So Muhannad said that they've been preserved. Very good. We'll get to that one. Rhythm with a message. I love it. So, yeah, we'll get to that somewhat. Accuracy, protected, nothing comparable. Okay, nothing comparable. Nothing can be compared. In what sense? Like there's no book as long as the Quran? No, it's not it. What is it, right? That's the idea. Okay. It contends, it challenges. Khadija, this will be the last one so we can move on, inshallah.
Assalamualaikum.
Thanks, salam.
It's not stories like a Bible does say stories. It has morals behind it, and it's more in detail and more attention to how it was revealed.
Okay. خلاص. Very nice. So the narrative has a uniquely effective narrative. All right. Someone said it's timeless. Very good. So we'll get through some of these, inshallah azza wa jal, tonight and Thursday night. Bi'idhnillah. The first thing I wanted to establish before now getting into the first dimension is that you guys are all right to not limit it to a single dimension. Some people think the Quran is like a scientific miracle. The Quran is like a linguistic miracle. That it is multidimensional. And we want to just touch some of these dimensions, and we will not touch all of them. We cannot touch all of them. So first and foremost, the Quran is a linguistic masterpiece. Yes, Caliph. You have a question? Or high-fiving me? Are we asking how we know? No, I was asking. I'm no longer asking this question. Now I'm going to tell you. A linguistic masterpiece. It is very important that, while establishing the Quran is miraculous in its language, or like incomparable in its language, can't be compared, no language like it, we shouldn't be sloppy in the way we argue this. And I say that because it is the right thing to say. We have to be honest. And because I've sort of fallen into this in my past as well. So we often, those who try to argue that the Quran is, linguistically incomparable, no other book has its language, its richness in language and all of this, you actually can't demonstrate that. Probably. I mean, I can't until today's demonstrate that. Because we are not experts of the Arabic language, right? So nobody is an expert of the Arabic language nowadays, for the most part, right? And so if you're going to say, oh, the Arabs were great at language, and then the Quran came and it blew it out the water, and then if someone were to just say, actually, I've studied Arabic extensively. Here's a page of Quran. Here's a page of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. Show me how. You wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't be able to. Does that mean we have to put this line of argument down altogether? I don't think so. I would say no. We can still argue this, but so long as we do it in the right way. We want to be methodical. How do we do it? We sort of reference people to the fact that, pay attention, all Quranic experts, Muslim, non-Muslim, okay? All of them generally agree. There's really no debate on this point, that the Quran is in a league of its own. Linguistically, the Quran is in a league of its own. Yes, they disagree on its source, obviously, or else they'd all be Muslim. But all of them agree that this is linguistically something unmatched. For example, and I'll bring to you some citations now, but even Edward Said, who's not a Muslim, he's a Columbia University professor, or was, passed about 20 years ago. He was a critic of culture and religion. The Oxford bibliographies calls him one of the world's foremost public intellectuals. He said he calls Arabic one of the most extraordinary constructions of the human mind, right? And he says in the Quran, sort of hands down between it and second place is a universe of lag. This is just one of many examples of contemporary academics. Then you go to the past as well. The people around the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam as well, Muslim or non-Muslim, generally saw this Quran as man, what do we do? How do we contend with this book? And so that's already one useful line of argument. Does anyone have any question about this? So it is one of the most extraordinary constructions of the human mind, meaning Arabic was extremely advanced, extremely sophisticated compared to all other languages, yet these super advanced, sophisticated Arabs, in terms of language, they didn't really have anything but language, by the way. They failed to produce a single chapter that was even similar, as per their own judges, that when an illiterate man, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, produced 6,000 verses of it. You know, the Quran challenged them and said, give me one chapter. You know, give me 10 chapters. Fine, give me one chapter. It happened in grades, right? Gradually. And then it said, فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ. It doesn't even have to be identical. Give me one chapter that's like it. Then it says, this is crazy, like incredible. It says, وَدْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُمْ. And you invite your judges, like your judges that would be in your favor, that would be biased, right? And that's what happened. Even the non-Muslims, the pagans were like, what can I possibly say? Like, there's no way I can convince people that this is better than that non-Quran is better than Quran. وَدْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُمْ. Invite you bring your own judges to testify for you. And then you see that the Prophet ﷺ himself, who could not read or write, has produced not a chapter. You know, the shortest chapter in the Quran is 2 lines, right? He has produced 6,000 verses of this book. And so that's how the linguistic challenge has never been met. And this is another example. You know, when they went to ask Al-Walid to say something against the Quran. Al-Walid was one of the wealthiest people in Quraysh. He went and he listened to the Quran. When he listened to the Quran, he said to them, oh man, like, what can I possibly say? They're like, you're the biggest authority on like everything linguistic here. Please help us out. Give us the best strategy to critique this Quran. He said, what can I possibly say? There's not a single man among you who knows prose or poetry better than me, or even the poems of the jinn than me. They believe that they knew poems from the jinn as well. And by Allah, what he, Muhammad, says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, has no resemblance to any of these things. He says, by Allah, his statement which he utters has such a sweetness to it, and a charm hovers over it. Like if you just come near it, you sense that there's something different about these words. He says its highest part, like just at the surface level meanings, they're fruitful, they're meaningful. And then the more you go in, right, the more you analyze, they gush forward without end. He says it dominates and cannot be dominated. There's no hope, right? And it will certainly crush all that is beneath it. I think someone had a question. Did someone have their hand raised? So here, fun fact, by the way. Al-Walid, when he said this to them, they said, oh man, like we're finished. If Al-Walid, people hear that Al-Walid is sort of, impressed by the Quran, we're in trouble. So what do? So Abu Jahl, one of the greatest enemies of Islam, he said, leave it to me, I got an idea. Al-Walid used to take so much pride in being the richest man in Mecca. Like they used to take pride in giving until today, but now Muslims do it, giving a new fabric, cloth to the Kaaba. Quraysh, the whole Quraysh would pool their money together to get new clothes for the Kaaba, right? A new covering for the Kaaba 1 year. And Al-Walid would single-handedly do it every single year. That was like a source of great boast and pride for him, that I can fund this myself every other year. You guys all help each other 1 year, I got the next year, like that. So he took great pride in his money. And so Abu Jahl knew his Achilles heel, his weak spot. So he went to Al-Walid and he said to him, you heard what the people are saying? The people are saying that you're praising the Quran's language. They're saying that the reason you're doing this is that business hasn't been good lately and you're hopeful that Muhammad will spend on you. And so that sort of got his defensiveness triggered, and he agreed to basically make a public allegation against the Quran. And he started thinking, what can I possibly say? What can I possibly say? And what did he finally say? Anyone know? What did he finally call the Quran? Someone say it. I'm done talking for a second. What accusation did they settle on against the Quran?
That is magic?
Who said it?
Muhammad.
Thank you, Muhammad. Jazakallahu khairan. Magic. This is, by the way, this whole discussion of what happened to Al-Walid is right there. If you want to go back to it, time will not allow us to. We'll go back to the beginning of Surah Al-Muddathir. فكر وقدر قتل كيف قدر ثم نظر ثم عبس وبصر ثم أدبر واستكبر فقال إن هذا إلا سحر يؤثر. You know, after, you know, he got like sort of provoked by the money accusation that Muhammad's going to spend on you, he started thinking, okay, what can we do, and calculating and strategizing, and he said sihrun yu'thar. This is just some magic. What's the problem with calling the Quran magic? I love this point. Someone tell me. Let's go, people. I need to drink my coffee in peace. You're not giving me chances.
كانوا they used to say that it يفرق بين المرء وأهله. That's like one of that's the effect of it.
That Jazakallah khairan. That's why it can't be magic, because we know magic. We know the effects of magic. Magic is destructive. Magic sort of breaks up families. But what if they're gonna say now? Never mind. What if they're gonna say? Why does it work against them to call the Quran magic? Allah blinded them to the fact that magic is supernatural. You get it? So when you say it's magic, you're actually unwittingly admitting that it's from another world. And so Allah blinded them due to their fervent to disprove the Quran from unintentionally admitting that there's something supernatural about this book. It's magic. And then from there, just to give you a little bit of the history, right? And then from there, things turned hostile. When calling it magic didn't work because of the reasons, many reasons. Of them is what the sister mentioned here, that it doesn't match up to magic. Then they got hostile. Said, okay, this is not working. Too many people are becoming Muslim. We gotta move from brains to brawn. When the brains failed, they went to brawn. And so then they turned to their swords eventually, right? First, it was boycotting them, starving them, and then driving them out of Mecca, and eventually went to swords. Imam al-Baqillani, rahimahullah, he makes a beautiful point here. Baqillani has one of the most famous books in Islamic history on the inimitability of the Quran, I'jazul Quran. The Quran has stumped people, cannot be imitated. I'jazul Quran, it's called. And so he has a book by that name. And he says there, of the greatest proofs that they were failed by their words, it even sounds nice in English too, even though he said it in Arabic. Of the greatest proofs that they were failed by their words was the fact that they felt forced to reach for their swords. I hope you caught that. The fact that you reach for your sword means you were failed by your words. Like, why would you spend your money and subject your chiefs to being killed and also kill your former tribesmen and sort of tribal strength and tribal loyalty was really big for them. It was like a survival mechanism and a source of honor. And why would you do all of that if you could pay a lesser price? So the fact that they reached for their swords was of the proofs that they were truly failed by their words. I want to share with you quickly this quote from Angelica Neuwirth. Angelica Neuwirth, she wrote this 6-volume commentary on the Quran. She's a German professor, and she's one of the foremost non-Muslim experts on Quran. So it's not just Al-Walid. This is the whole point. This is not just Walid. She said this in an interview. This is not in the book. She said, no one has succeeded. And this is right. I really think that the Quran has even brought Western researchers embarrassment who weren't able to clarify how suddenly in an environment where there were not any appreciable written texts appeared this Quran out of nowhere, right? With its richness of ideas and its magnificent wordings. And so that is a point for you to sort of put in your artillery belt, or I want you to digest before we move past linguistics, that whether we're talking about, pre-modern times or in modern times, those who are true experts on the language and familiar with the Quran know, regardless of whether they admit it's from God or not, they know this book is a masterpiece that cannot be matched. Any questions about this? Can you say who the author was that said this and wrote the book? There's actually, this class is being recorded. And I'm projecting slides. So inshallah, when you go to the recordings, it's all on screen. So it's, yeah, it's Angelica New Worth, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Any questions about this point? You know, someone can say, yeah, but technically it's not over. It's not over. Like maybe someone in 100, who knows, 1,000 years will come and outdo the Quran. So you can't actually say the Quran challenged and everybody failed because, you know, there's still people around. What would your response to this be, by the way? Think with me. I'm playing advocate of Shaitan before he gets locked up for Ramadan. Right? If someone were to say, devil's advocate here, if someone were to say, but it's not over yet, maybe this challenge will one day be met, what would your response be? Come on, people, you're 100 deep. I'm sure someone's got something thoughtful to say and they're just shy.
Astaghfirullah. Never. Astaghfirullah.
Astaghfirullah al-Azim. Okay.
No,
You're
well,
gonna say that. You're gonna say that to yourself. But how about them? Like, what are we gonna do?
Just bring on the challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, it
So
is like
that they have to produce something like they was originally said.
Yeah. Okay. Jazakallah khair. Muhammad, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna say that this is something you can say like for like pretty much all the time. If it's true that it can be challenged, then you will never see someone, you'll never find someone, and you're gonna die. You're gonna on misguidance. It's not really an argument, you know, if you think about it. It's just, oh well, no one has done it yet. Well, no one's gonna do it if the claim is true. So it's nothing to measure against. That makes sense.
Right. Theoretical plausibility is not something that we actually operate on, right? Because that
Exactly.
makes you paralyzed. How do I know I exist? That's called radical skepticism. How do I know I'm not colorblind and that green light is actually red? Maybe I should stop, right? And so for someone to be willing to entertain these things when the, you know, the foremost experts in this language for 1,500 years agree, right? Whether they're Muslim or not. And you're saying, yeah, but technically there's still some time on the clock. And when you reach for straws like that, and this is an important point, that this is for us more than anything else, because you finding the truth is very different than you wanting the truth. And so just because you have the greatest, you know, arsenal of proofs for why the Quran is from God doesn't mean the person you have a conversation with will actually accept it, because if you bring him the angels, he might say, I'm intoxicated, right? If he spoke to the dead and they told him we saw paradise and the hellfire, we can tell them maybe you were hallucinating. The Quran actually says this, right? So you got to be careful of even being stained by those whose hearts are infected with radical skepticism. Okay, so that's sort of just proving by referring to authority that the Quran is an absolute masterpiece, right? I really like this this explanation on how the Quran, sort of the rationalization now. Another explanation, this was given by Dr. Bassem Sayyah, to help us appreciate this. Like, how can the Quran, when its language, ever qualify to be a miracle? So he says, and I'm going to read it off the slide for those who aren't seeing the slide. The miraculousness of the Quran lies in this very paradox. Paradox means contradiction. The paradox of its being truly Arabic and its being at one and the same time a new language. He says, and this might appear to be illogical. He says, however, the logic of miracle inheres in precisely the fact that it surpasses logic. So a miracle that rests on logic ceases to be a miracle. So let me try to unpack that for you. He's saying that, look, you need to understand, it's not just like people are aesthetically or subjectively just saying, yeah, Quran's awesome, I really love the Quran. Quran's language is so exquisite, it's such a masterpiece. No, it's not subjective. He's saying the Quran is a sophisticated, Arabic is a sophisticated, mature, advanced language with very strict structure, very strict rules, right? It's not arbitrary and subjective. I feel this is eloquent. He says, and despite it being like that, The Quran broke away from it. The Quran does not respect these rules. The Quran does not use the conventions of Arabic that have been so well refined. And at the same time, nobody denies that it's so clearly Arabic. So it's totally Arabic, but it's totally not. It's not Arabic because it doesn't fall in line with any Arabic anyone has ever used before the Quran, by the way, or ever used after the Quran. The style of the Quran has never been used. It doesn't line up to any of the conventions of Arabic, the compositional structure of Arabic. At the same time, it's so crystal clear. That's what he's trying to say. How does that work? How is it so clearly Arabic, but it doesn't line up with the Arabic we know whatsoever? And that is why, the great poets like Labid ibn Rabi'a and others are now retiring. They heard the Quran and said, wow, I'm never going to say poetry again. Some of them are becoming Muslim like Labid. It's truly amazing what the Quran did. I hope that sort of helped you give another angle of how to speak to this point. There's one last thing I want to do before I walk away from linguistics, which is comparing, or not comparing actually, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or the Quran's language with the language of Shakespeare. So some background on this issue. One of the academic experts on Islam, who is non-Muslim, he's an Orientalist scholar. So basically those who study Islam to critique it. His name was Arthur J. Arbery. Arthur J. Arbery was, interestingly, so well versed in Quran, non-Muslim, that he actually has his own translation of the Quran. And I hear it's pretty good. I haven't flipped through it myself. You can Google Quran translated by Arthur J. Arbery and you'll have it. So just to show you that he's not some pushover. In any case, he says, though, I believe he says this in the intro of the translation, he says that just because the Quran is in a league of its own linguistically, so he admits it, here's another one, just admitting it, doesn't mean the Muslims should get carried away and say it's supernatural. They're exaggerating. So you get it? He's agreeing that linguistically it's unmatched, it's unparalleled, but that doesn't mean it's divine. He goes, that's a stretch. And then he argues that he goes, look, every language has its masterpiece. You have the sonnets of Shakespeare in English. You have the Iliad of Homer in Greek. No one ever said the sonnets of Shakespeare are from God. No one ever said, the Iliad of Homer is from God. And so maybe because I got dragged through English literature as an undergrad, I have a particular bone to pick with this line of argument. Maybe that's my my impetus subconsciously. But when he says something like this, he is really, really overlooking humongous differences. Why that comparison doesn't work. Why you can never really compare the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with Shakespeare. And so here are 10 points. They're adapted from and inspired by Dr. Sami Amiri's work in Barahin al-Nubuwah, a very long, extensive book he has on the proofs of prophethood, and also in particular responding to Orientalist critiques against the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So he speaks to this point, and it was really nice what he did there. And I just sort of built on it a little bit by consulting some experts in the space and then moving it into the English language. So credit goes to him after Allah Azza wa Jal. Let's get to it. So he mentions, or let me just jump to the English after product. We mentioned 10 major differences between the Prophet ﷺ and Shakespeare. Every time I do this, people pay attention. Every time I do this, someone has to get up and say, Astaghfirullah, it's an insult to the Prophet ﷺ that you even compare him to Shakespeare. That's not what I'm doing. I'm telling you why Arthur Arbery is wrong for comparing the Prophet ﷺ to Shakespeare. Okay? Of course, there's a world of difference between our Prophet ﷺ and even Muslims, even righteous Muslims, let alone Shakespeare. How miraculous that Allah can grant whoever He wills the ability to recite, memorize, learn Arabic, anyone from any nation. Yes, we're going to get to that. Tahira. Jazakallah khair for that ad. Beautiful. So first and foremost, who had a formal education? Who had access to books and libraries? Shakespeare was formally trained in English, in Latin. The Prophet ﷺ was not formally trained, did not read and write even in Arabic. ﷺ. Okay, that's number one. Number two, who wrote for a living? That was Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a professional playwright. Okay, that means he got paid to sit and refine his craft, production after production. He's improving his skill day in and day out. He has the ability to dedicate time. He made money off of this, right? So he wrote for a living. The Prophet ﷺ was a shepherd and a tradesman, and never did any of this. Never said a verse of poetry, a full couplet of poetry in his life. ﷺ. Number three, who brought to the world a new compositional structure? Remember that? Back to this point. Who used a brand new utilization of the language? Let me compare. The Prophet ﷺ, we already said, he doesn't conform to the conventions of Arabic. Shakespeare's not the guy who invented sonnets. For those of you who study, like, English literature, poetry, you know this. Sonnets were not, they existed for hundreds of years before Shakespeare. He was just one of the better, employers of sonnets. That's it. He was one of the best people that wrote in sonnet form. You guys know what sonnet form is. Like, you guys remember haiku and sonnets, and there's like a certain measure you have to live up to, right? Compositional structure, how many syllables and whatnot. And so Shakespeare used something pre-existing. The Prophet ﷺ used something that never existed before and no one was able to match it after. So he brought a new compositional structure to the world. That's number three. Number four, it's what's called stylometry. Stylometry is a big flex word that you can flex with. Astaghfirullah. It's a clunky word for basically what they call author discrimination. It's a mathematical method. Basically, how it works is you take everything I've ever written. All right, let's make believe. How much you know? Everything I've ever written on Facebook and whatever you can get your hands on of my writing, and in book, whatever. And then you punch it into a software. So the software begins to pick up on my writing style, what kind of words I use, what kind of length of my sentences, all of that, right? Now, the idea here is 1,000 years from now, someone uncovers, as if they care, but someone uncovers a manuscript that says written by Muhammad Shinawi. So you put it into the software and it measures according to writing styles, metric of stylometry, right? It tells you, yeah, that actually is Muhammad's writing. It matches up well with his patterns. Or that's not Muhammad Shinawi's writing. He doesn't write like that. You get it? And so this is, by the way, how they discriminated that some of the books of the Bible, or the books of the Bible that are attributed even to Paul of Tarsus, are actually not the works of Paul. They can't be written by Paul. And so basically what they did here is some did about, I believe it was 12 experiments where they compared the language of the Quran with the language of Hadith. Okay? You take Sahih al-Bukhari, throw it in. Then you throw the Quran in. How much do they match up stylistically? And they found like a huge disparity. Like, I believe it was something like 60 to 70% of the time, depending on what you're controlling for or measuring, the words of the Quran don't show up in the Hadith at all. Or the words of the Quran don't show up in the Hadith at all. I forget which of the two right now. So what does that offer you? That offers you basically like a mathematical or objective way to say conclusively, there's no way the Quran and the Hadith both come from Muhammad. They can't come from the same source. I'm only saying this because we're not expert Arabs. And so like the people around the Prophet Muhammad already knew it. They already knew. We live with this guy, this man for 40 years. We know how he talks. We know everything about him. He speaks like us, day-to-day talk, everyday talk. The Hadith are his everyday talk as well. Just now the messages are from God. When it came to the Quran, they knew right away, this is not Muhammad's words. So basically, Shakespeare's style of writing is crystal clear. If we found a manuscript, someone said Shakespeare, we could throw it in and confirm or disqualify it from being Shakespeare's, because you can't write in two completely different ways. And so that showed us that the Quran, it would be impossible for the Prophet ﷺ to live 23 years self-policing. You get it? Like, this set of words, vocabulary, is only for the Quran, and this set of words is going to be for my day-to-day life. I'm only going to use the word door on Sundays. for 20 years. Or not going to use the word door on Sundays for 20 years. It's humanly impossible, right? You know, something very interesting, and it gave me chills the other day. I've never heard this before. I shared it with someone to throw it on social media. You know, it was very, very beautiful. It mentions that forget comparing the Quran with the Hadith. Even if you just measure the Quran with the Quran, there's something unbelievable, which is that there are, even in the shortest surahs of the Quran, you think surahs like short surahs, you know, like how much flexibility do you have? No, every single surah in the Quran, no matter how short, has words, terms that are used there that are not reused in any other surah of the Quran, in any other of the 113 surahs. You know, he used the example of Al-Kawthar, Al-Abtar, Shani'aka, right? Think of Inna A'tanak Al-Kawthar, shortest surah. Those don't exist anywhere else in the Quran. So how do you do that? And so that's the whole stylometry. The next one is the unwavering eloquence of the Quran. Sister Sundus, we have 12 minutes. Am I right? Firm 12 minutes, right?
Yes, we're ending 9:30, inshallah.
Okay. Should I stop and leave room for questions, or just let them trickle in as they trickle in?
I think as they're coming in, unless there's really a lot of questions people have.
Fantastic. So let me at least get through this slide, and then I will defer everything else, inshallah, to next week, and we'll move much faster next week. I think I moved a bit slower than I wanted to, but inshallah, there's benefit. The point is not to rattle these things off. I hope you're digesting this and committing it, inshallah, to your memory. Unwavering eloquence. So here goes my trauma from being an English major. Every class you go into that talks about Shakespeare, if betting was halal, you could bet big money on them stopping on certain brilliant segments in Shakespeare. You know, like what, to be or not to be in Macbeth, or you know, a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. And those are the segments that all the experts say, oh man, Shakespeare really killed it there. He really, you know, there was a mic, it would have been a mic drop moment. You know, he outdid himself right there. So segments of distinct brilliance. Now compare that with the Quran. In other words, like, it's not all of Shakespeare that's worth stopping at. It's just he really, you know, had some really beautiful passages in how he wielded the language. Does that exist with the Quran? No, it doesn't. The Quran in its entirety has unwavering eloquence. Nothing is suboptimal. And the proof of this is that the Arab, just to get an idea of their culture, the Arab had nothing going for them, I said, but language. Like, they were primitive in so many civilizational respects, and it was language. And they were so brutal with language that they would call, here's a fun fact, not nice, but fun fact. They would call non-Arab Ajam. You guys know there's Arab, then there's Ajam. You guys may hear these terms. Ajam actually means speechless. Like, anyone who's not us, you guys aren't even talking. Like, you guys are inanimate objects. Your language stinks. You guys can't articulate the way we can. But even among themselves, among fellow Arab, they had this brutal, what we call nowadays literary critique, right? A literary critique tradition called the Naqd tradition. Naqd means dismantling. So what they would do is that they'd sit there and listen to each other's poetry and brutally scrutinize each other's poetry. That was okay, but considering the theme, this would have been a better metaphor. This would have been a better analogy. That term, this conjugation of it would have been superior. They just sit there tearing each other's language apart, right? Now, in that climate, nobody has ever identified a passage of Quran that could be bettered, that could be improved on, right? That's also very unique. That's not Shakespeare at all. That's not human. Number 6, challenged his peers. Did Shakespeare say, like, you know, nobody can ever bring this? No, he never said that. And by the way, Shakespeare, here's another like falter that Arbery, you know, Shakespeare is not the undisputed best playwright in all of English by unanimous agreement. No, he's not. Remember I said everybody agrees that the Quran is in a league of its own, regardless of whether it's from God or not. That's not true with Shakespeare. They don't say Shakespeare's writings are in a league of their own. There are literary experts in English who rank Shakespeare number 7, like Hugh Craig from Newcastle University, I mentioned in the book. So this exists. So Shakespeare was just the number 1, according to many experts, but he recognized, and sort of those who rank him number 1 recognize that it's arguable. It's not conclusive. This is our assessment. But everyone understood Shakespeare was human. Shakespeare, produced things that are producible by human effort. He's a champ to some. He's the number 1. He's the champ to some, but he's in an arena of worthy competitors. The Prophet ﷺ, we already explained this in great detail, that he would shame them at every turn. Come on, you guys are the experts. Bring something like it, anything like it. Bring your own judges. Bring a short passage, right? And yet no one could. Number 7, who had the luxury of using fiction? The Quran is speaking about like uncomfortable truths. You guys know when experts talk, it's very easy to fall asleep. When they're talking about philosophy or medicine or engineering, or the Quran is talking about like existential realities, how to understand existence. It's talking about philosophy. It's talking about, like the diseases in the inner crevices of our hearts. It's talking about world history. It's talking about law and legal technicality. All of that, you'd think, it wouldn't really have the appeal that it has, right? Whereas Shakespeare, he gets to write by whatever, he gets to make up stories, love stories, romance, drama, suspense, thrillers. And so the Quran was far more limited in its scope to appeal to the audience. Then bring it to number 8. Who had universal appeal? Despite Shakespeare having, the leeway of fiction, if I were to put together, a play in my masjid, shoot me before I do this, Yani. But a Shakespeare play at my masjid, who would show up? Almost nobody, right? Upper middle class, college educated, Caucasian folks. That's probably who would care, right? And I don't, of course, mean that as like a slight to Caucasian folks, but this is just, it's a cultural preference, right? Now, if I were to do a Quran night and bring some like expert reciters on the Quran, who would show up? Everybody and their mother and their grandchild. Different walks of life, different age groups, different linguistic backgrounds. How did the Quran have such a universal appeal, even to those who don't fully understand it, right? Number 9, okay, I'm down to the wire now. Number 9, who had the leeway or the flexibility of being creative, like creative liberty? What does that mean, creative liberty versus interactivity? Let me try to simplify this. Let's imagine Shakespeare wasn't using fiction, but he still got to choose what he will and will not speak about, okay? Let's imagine that. The Quran now is interacting with its audience in real time. Can you, like, there are, for example, 13 passages in the Quran where the Quran says, "Oh Muhammad, they ask you about the moons. Oh Muhammad, they ask you about the menstrual cycles. Oh Muhammad, they ask you about money to be spent in charity. Oh Muhammad, and immediately they ask you about this because they did. So, and there's a response to the question immediately. Can you imagine me trying to give an eloquent lecture, a profound, gripping lecture, and you guys keep asking me questions? Well, this is a study class, right? But can you imagine I'm like telling you about, like, I don't know, paradise and the hellfire, and someone says, "Shaykh, like, do I have to pay zakat on my jewelry?" And then like I answer the question and I get back to my subject and get back to my subject. Someone jumps on and says, "Shaykh, her dad said I can't marry her because, of my skin color." And then, I get back to my subject. How eloquent would this lecture be, right? The Quran is interacting. And by the way, not just interacting to their questions. Those are just like 13, if you count the repeats, like 16 questions. Then you have the events. The Quran is interacting with the events. Like, can you imagine the Prophet ﷺ let's make believe for a second what they're saying. He made up the Quran. is he expected to be as eloquent in those moments in the night when he's putting the Quran together, supposedly, and those other moments when, you know, he's going through the traumatic experiences of the battlefield where his uncle, or the moments when he's losing family members and he's weeping and alayhi salatu wassalam, and he's praying janazah and he's devastated and he's bleeding. Quran came down in those instances. Should we expect the Quran interacting with events impromptu to be just as eloquent? How do you compare that with Shakespeare sitting there under a candlelight, you know, drinking his chamomile tea, if it existed, writing what he wants to write about? That's number 9. Number 10, this is the kicker. This is the kicker. Who wrote their book in linear fashion, beginning, middle, end? Shakespeare or Muhammad? Not just Shakespeare. Everyone does this. Who doesn't do this? You write your book like this or like this, but the point is it's linear. It's a line, right? Beginning, middle, end. The Quran, you got to know that the Quran didn't come down in the order that we have today. The Quran came down in pieces. It was puzzled together, right? And so can, like, imagine a painting or a tapestry, and you painted it like this, right? A piece of this surah, then a piece of that surah, then a piece of this surah, then this whole surah, then a piece of that surah, and all of a sudden, all that pixelation, all that segment, all that randomization in our eyes becomes this masterpiece of a tapestry. Who can write like that? Who can produce literature like that? And the Quran wasn't even written. The Quran was spoken. And so, you know, I'm out of time, but there's one ayah in the Quran, and there are many like it, but we don't have time right now. But it is so shaming to those that are in denial after discovering the Quran that it must be from Allah. Allah says about the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salatu wassalam, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. You, O Muhammad, never used to, before this Quran, recite any sort of scripture, any sort of like words, you never recited anything before this day, nor did your right hand ever inscribe anything. وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. Then he says, here it is, إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. Had that been the case, if you ever used to like memorize stuff or write things, in that case, those who call you false, the deniers, al-mubtilun, those who call you batil, the falsifiers, lartab, they would have had a reason to doubt. And this is so powerful, right? Why is it so powerful? Because if the Prophet Muhammad could write, if the Prophet Muhammad was trained in poetry, right? You still wouldn't have much of a reason to doubt, because everyone that can read and write and, you know, is versed in rhetoric has failed. So it's as if the Quran is saying, if you can read and write, they would have had a 1 in a million chance, 1 in a million reason to doubt, source of doubt. But since you couldn't read and write, they don't even have a 1 in a million. So you see, sort of, subhanAllah, the what do they call it? The dialectic strength of the Quran, like the debate strength of the Quran. You guys have no basis whatsoever. If he could read and write, you would have a very, very shallow reason to doubt, a superficial reason to doubt. What happens when he couldn't even? Alayhi salatu wassalam. Any questions, final questions before we close out? Here's a teaser for next Thursday. I'm sorry, this Thursday, right? How the Quran was remarkably accurate about historical events that would have been impossible for him to know, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Yes, Sarah.
Wait, could you explain again what you mean that if he was alayhi salatu a poet, they would have a doubt, like a little bit of a doubt? Why?
It's as if the Quran is saying, if you were a literarian, if you were a spoken word artist, right, a poet, they would have had a 1% reason to doubt. You get it?
But why would they on that basis?
This is called tanazzul. Tanazzul is like What is tanazzul? For argument's sake, type line of reasoning. Meaning, because this is not, this is sort of closer to being poetry. It is poetic, it is closer to being, but you guys have, so there's one of two interpretations. I need to be honest. There's one of two interpretations to this verse. One of the interpretations is the people of the book would have had a reason to doubt because their books say that the last prophet is going to be illiterate. So since he's not illiterate, since he is illiterate, then you have no reason whatsoever to doubt. The other interpretation for this is that this is speaking to the pagans of Mecca, and it could be speaking to both at once, right? Pagans at once saying, if he had some skill in poetry, if he knew a little bit of poetry, right, you would have had a reason to doubt, meaning because this does have a resemblance to the charm of poetry, or the rhythmic resemblance of poetry. Does the Quran have a rhythm? Yes, it does. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's called, like when you say something for argument's sake. I'm not even saying it's true, but for argument's sake, had you said this, it would have been a hair better, right? That's what the Quran is saying. Meaning the Quran is saying you guys don't even have a strand of hair to hold on to. You guys have nothing. You're being totally preposterous. Anything else? Any other questions?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
How does a person cure that skepticism, like the irrational skepticism, even when they logically have the proof to stand against the false arguments? Like when you know it in your mind, but you can't prove it to your heart, so to speak.
That's a beautiful question. There are, of course, levels of this that would benefit a lot from just clinical treatment. Even people that have OCD, right? They just can't shake off the whisper that they know is debilitating or works against them. And so of what they go through is cognitive behavioral therapy, right? How do you shake off this whisper? And so it's almost like a muscle. You get coached through it. But a little bit of this can be done on your own if you can manage it, which is to not give in to questions that are unproductive, that are not productive, questions that are paralyzing. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ guided us to, and it is actually the very same protocol that psychiatric workers or specialists, psychiatric health providers use, which is self-interruption. How do you interrupt yourself from these thoughts? Because if you give in to them, they get louder and louder and louder. That's a big part of it. But ultimately, these sorts of episodes, I've gone through them in my life as well, to be honest. They are a great reason for a person to recognize their fragility in front of Allah and to ask Allah Azza wa Jal to cure them of it. Like, I don't own my heart. I don't own my mind. That's how fragile I am. Allah does. And so to show your poverty to Allah Azza wa Jal and to ask him to cure you of this, no matter what I tried, I couldn't get rid of it, by the way. And when it finally went, I have no idea why it went. But in the course of that journey, I learned how to make dua. I learned, how conceited I was. And I hope I've benefited from that journey. And so in general, I would, remind you all that a part of this is spiritual enlightenment. It is from Allah Azza wa Jal to just open your eyes and clear your paths. So don't make that the last door you knock on. That's a part of, rather the most important part of the recovery process. Any other questions? Or actually, send this up to you. I don't mind if you don't mind. But if you guys want a firm stop, we can do that as well.
No, mashallah, I didn't imagine we were going to have so many participants in today's class. We have actually over 100 people. We live streamed the class after we saw that we reached capacity and more people wanted to enter. And now people are even writing on the chat, we can go more beyond 1 hour. SubhanAllah. So Jazakallah khair for this amazing class. I think if there aren't any more questions, inshallah, we're going to continue the class on Thursday. And if we need to extend it to like an hour and a half to, you know, complete your slides, inshallah, we can do that for Thursday, bi'idhnillah.
Sounds good. Jazakallah khair, everybody. I'll let you close
So,
us.
inshallah. So the class will continue on Thursday, inshallah, on the 23rd at 8:30 p.m., exactly like we did for tonight. And this class is in preparation for Ramadan, since Ramadan is the month of the Quran, and we wanted to, you know, give us an opportunity to connect and understand the Quran further, inshallah. We also have one more class coming up in March, which is Fiqh of Zakah, which is also in preparation for Ramadan, since a lot of people have questions in regards to, you know, giving their zakah when it comes to Ramadan, inshallah. So we will send out the recording. It will be on our social media. So if, you know, if you have somebody who wasn't able to attend the class, they can see the recording, inshallah.